I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Hellbent for Horror. And hey, guess what? Happy Halloween to all of you. I hope you're having a great holiday. Now, I think I may be speaking to some of the people who are very similar to me and my friends. Most of us, friends that I have at least, we don't have a 24-hour period that we call Halloween. We tend to go a little bit longer. We extend the holiday a bit more. And some of us go 60 days. I've actually had friends tell me that they do 60 days. That feels pretty exhaustive for me on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I must say, I like to try and keep Halloween in my heart all year long, but really celebrating it, I try to keep that to 31 days, and I think most people that I know that are friends of mine tend to do that 31 days, and we celebrate it in a whole bunch of different ways. What I think is interesting about it is taking a look at the celebration itself. Why? What are we trying to get at? If I say that I like to have Halloween in my heart all year round, then what is it that I'm trying to do specifically, ritualistically perhaps, over a 31-day period? And I think part of it, the thing that hits me the most, is that I'm trying to reclaim something from the past, a feeling, emotions. I get it sometimes when I'm walking my dog at night, especially at this time of the year, autumn, when it's starting to get cool and crisp in the Bay Area of California. And the sunsets are usually pretty spectacular at this time of the year. And I'll be walking, and I'm not scared of the dark. It's not that I get scared, but there is this moment of anticipation that takes me back to being a child at sunset, really at dusk, when the sun is really setting and you get a little bit past magic hour and you start looking down alleys and looking down streets, and there's just this feeling of, I must get home, that I used to have when I was a kid. 9 out of 10 times, if I wasn't in by the time that the sun went down, I was going to be in trouble. But I think there's something about the sun setting, this idea that Halloween itself, if we go back to the ancient times that we at least know of, when it was called Samhain, and it was this idea of a celebration of the last harvest prior to the winter coming in. It was also this idea, of course, you've heard probably, the veils between worlds are at its thinnest. But it's really a remembrance of the dead. It's not just the idea that there are spirits that are coming through. There is this remembrance of our beloved lost ones, our beloved loves, our beloved dead. And I think that there is a reclamation not only of remembering the people who have passed, but also just some of the emotional energy that has passed, our memories, in other words. And so how do we do this when we're in this time period? What makes this 31 days a little bit special? Well, people have different ways of doing it. One of the most popular things that I think you'll see, especially for on social media, is people will watch a horror movie a day and report about it on social media. Very good and very fun. I love watching my friends go through that, because sometimes I get good ideas of things for me to watch. Most of the time, I'm watching people experiencing a movie that I may have experienced before for the first time, and kind of smiling as I see their responses. Other times I get, this feeling of them going back to an old chestnut, right? That's, I think, a very Halloween thing to do. You might go back to horror movies that you like at other times of the year, but I think if you're going to go back to films that you almost know by heart that are horror films, it tends to be around Halloween. One of the things that happens as well, it's not just watching these movies. Sometimes there's a little bit more behind it. I have a friend, Dr. AC, he's known as professionally Aaron. He does this thing every year that he calls the Scare-a-thon. And it's essentially 31 movies in 31 days, but it's not just him watching them and then reporting on them. What he does is he gets other people to be guest panelists, and he knows quite a few people. He knows folks in the entertainment business and music business, in the literature business, actors, nut jobs like myself, people like that, and he will ask them to come on and do a 30 to 40 minute piece on how they felt about the movie to try and get some people donating to a cause. And the cause that he tries to raise funds for and awareness for is Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project, WRRAP. And I've been on there several times this year. It's been a lot of fun, and it's fun to meet new people who are friends of a friend. And whenever we're together, and it's not people that I know that are on the Zoom, most of the time I know at least one person, but it's great to meet new folk and realize how many people have this astonishing love for film and astonishing love for horror films, and not very low standard conversation. They really want to talk about cinema. They really want to talk about the emotions. They really want to talk about what the movie's trying to get at. And so I'm always jazzed when I get to spend some time and speak with people that are like that. Now, that's the movie side. Others of us do somewhat stranger things, and I had a wonderful time walking my dog today, where I walked by a bunch of houses that were decorated for Halloween. And some very modestly, and then others that really, they find their own language of how to speak about Halloween. And I got to speak to a few of the people. They were outside of their house, large glowing pumpkins, huge graveyards, and then things like projection screens. And so I walked over and thanked them for their enjoyment of Halloween, but also giving something to the community, which is how I look at it. And I told them where my house was, and I'd love them to see mine. And they were like, oh, one of them went, oh, you're the one with the really big thing. And yes, I am the one with the really big thing. In other words, my house is my love for Halloween comes out kind of like, I talk about horror being a lot like German Expressionism, where German Expressionism was this idea, this art movement that was taking the internal emotions that we had and externally bringing them out of the body into the story itself. The imagery comes from the trying to get an emotional response. And I would say that my emotional response comes out on my house. It's a little bit of German Expressionism gone mad, writ large, a little bit of my id spilling all over the place. And it's basically a month-long decoration of my house. And it's gotten to the point now where I'm getting older, so I'm realizing that, we'll have a greatest hits kind of thing. Maybe something new doesn't have to happen every year. I still have like 120 skulls on one side of my house, just because I always thought that looked so cool. And it is somewhat impressive. Not everybody gets to see them because they are too busy looking at everything else. But on the side of the house, I have them lit nicely and everything. There's this really interesting kind of catacombs. And, I love that kids come by to watch. I love that every day people drive by and their windows are down and their kids are pointing at everything that's there. But also, sometimes it's just teenagers and sometimes it's just adults driving by. I have people who walk by every day, and they're always very nice to me as they see me swearing up a blue streak as things are not working the way that they're supposed to, and I'm getting all sorts of stuff in my hair and getting scratched all over the place. They're still telling me how much they enjoy it, and I may have mentioned this before, but it's me paying it forward. This is something that was super important to me as a kid. Finding the houses that were decorated. Halloween was my favorite holiday. And there was a house, the Antonelli house, in my hometown of West Hazelton. And they did it to the nines all the time. And I swore that if I ever got out of the world that I was living in at that time, which was somewhat unhappy, if I could get my own place, and if I was able to be lucky enough to get a house, I was going to do the same thing. I was going to be there to be this weird day glow beacon for children who may be trying to escape something in their own mind, in their own place, whatever it is, if they feel as if they are somehow trapped in the reality of the world, that this weird fantasy, if they're hip to Halloween, they have somewhere that they can go. And in other words, Halloween was an act of defiance for me. My love of horror in a deeply religious household was pretty much a revolutionary act. And, I'll talk more about that later. We'll go into a little bit more about how I feel about Halloween and how this is really a ritual. This is kind of trying to recapture that background, that old time, the seance in a weird way between the old me and the new me, or the present me, however you want to say it, the casting of these runes. One of the things that I do every year is I put up my first Halloween decoration. And that's the Halloween decoration that I got when I was renting an apartment many, many years ago. And it wasn't even like one of those great skeletons that you might be able to get that seems anatomically correct from your spirit store or any of the other big stores. Even Target and stuff have pretty good skeletons now. This was the kind that you got in a plastic bag at a grocery store, where all of the digits of the hands were all one piece. The feet were all one piece. The head was just a big plastic vacuum mold with black paint on it. And so I got it. And that's what I could afford. And that at an apartment, I was allowed to hang something outside, even though it was really not a building kind of apartment. It was more like suites. So there were four different houses, I think, or different apartments in every complex. So we had a staircase going up to our metal door, and I was allowed to at least put something on the staircase, on the metal, on the railings and things like that, and something on the door. So I did get this plastic skeleton, and I cut out the eye holes, and I put spaces between the teeth, and I carved a little bit so that the jaw was a little bit hooked. So in other words, I took something that was hollow inside and made it really hollow. But what I did is I spray painted the inside black so you couldn't see the plastic inside, and I painted it in certain ways, and I put wire on it, and I hung it over the staircase, and people were like, wow, look how cool that is. And we used to get one or two Halloweeners at that time, trick-or-treaters that would come. It is something that I put in, even though it's a mess now. I can't really put it up because it's, 20 years or more old. And it is kept in a box. It's been painted many different colors. It's been glued together. It's been taped together. And sometimes it just sits in a bush. But I know that it's there. I know that it is the one piece that everything else is built off. It is the lodestar. So this puzzle piece, it's to a ritual that's lifelong. It's this spell of Halloween. It's the past informing the present. It is dancing with the dead. It's dancing with the dead idea, the lost youth, the lost enjoyment, whatever it might be that we conjure back. Anyway, it's something that I consider, when I look at it, as suburban white boy hoodoo, I guess. I always like that there's voodoo and there's hoodoo. And I always thought hoodoo is really interesting because it can be, when you're talking about hoodoo, it's whatever is important and has power and energy to the person doing the conjuring and the person being conjured upon, or whatever the deity might be. And it could be something as simple as someone who was kind to you in a subway, whatever it might be. But it can ritual bits, and they only make sense in that form of hoodoo. So you can have a cigar box full of junk, bottle caps, photos. There's no need for sage. There's no need for chicken bones. There's no need to grind up coffee beans unless you happen to be from Ecuador, and then it would make sense. All these things are not necessary. There's something suburban and urban and real about what goes on in hoodoo. And I think that what we do is we find a spiritual connection. Whatever it is that speaks to you is going to have the power to actually speak for you as well. And so my Halloween decorations are just that. When I'm doing this on a 31-day thing, and I start doing the decorations on October 1st, and a lot of times they don't end until, I don't know, maybe 4 o'clock in the evening on the 31st. It is a ritual that is continuing. And so, yes, I'm casting runes, and runes being these small tiles that might have these not hieroglyphics, but alphabets that are lost and ancient, whatever it might be, on pieces of wood even. And people would throw these down, and they would be able to try and find a pattern that would say something about what the future was going to be. Whatever it was, that's the kind of runes, these little charms, these devotionals to Halloween. It's a constantly growing work that I have. It's both a hello and a goodbye, kind of, to be a little bit more pedantic and symbolic. The idea of the hello and goodbye that are on Ouija boards. My work around Halloween, my devotionals of Halloween, my fun for Halloween is kind of a hello, goodbye. You're saying welcome back to whatever that spirit might be inside you, and saying goodbye to it because it's also very temporary. It's very ephemeral. I like the hello, goodbye, the bittersweet. Anyway, I'm going to talk about how I cast these runes. And I'm hoping that talking about this, speaking about it how I have, this idea of memory, sense memory that brings back a part of you that may be lost, that Halloween does for you. I'm hoping that you can close your eyes, maybe listen to what I'm saying, but also think about the things that you might do, the things that you might remember. I mean, when I first think about Halloween, I think about going to school, and on my way to school, once again showing my age, going into what was known as a 5 and dime store, things that were on sale really cheap. And it was a place that you usually would get model kits and baseballs and things like that, stuff for Boy Scouts. And you would walk in, and there was just this smell to these places. It was all wooden floors, and there were leaves dead inside of the building, whatever it might be. But I would smell that, and I can always see the Aurora model kits, the one of Frankenstein, the one of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the one of Dracula. These were things that I would go and see, and I couldn't quite afford them, but I would take a look at them. I'd pick up the box, and I'd be like, oh my gosh. So I remember that. And those images are strong. The smell is strong, but what it is it's really kind of revving up a whole bunch of memories that come through. And that's childhood, of course. But there's also ones that I love to get the emotional impact of whatever it is that entertains me as well. And that's one of the things about rewatching movies that I may know by rote, and yet at Halloween I feel the need to go back into them and absorb them, take a conversation with them. It's kind of like walking through woods that you know, or a neighborhood that you know, or whatever it might be that excites you and interests you and piques your interest and gets you a little bit adventurous. There's a lot of stuff that I do, especially when I am putting my decorations up. I find that if I don't have headphones on and if I'm not listening to something, my temper just gets really flared quickly doing all of this stupid stuff. So I find that audiobooks are really good. So there are certain audiobooks that have now become things that I just must listen to every year. They just have a lot of energy to them. And Ghost Story, Peter Straub's Ghost Story, and rest in peace, Peter. Ghost Story is one of those that I have to come back to. The opening paragraph is amazing. If you don't know it, pick it up or just take a look and do a Google search, you'll get this wonderful little piece of discussion between two characters that you don't know yet. And it just has this wonderful energy to it. It reminds me of when I first read that book and how, in a way, my knowledge of horror, that feeling of horror, that love for it, was still very fresh. So everything in that book was so much of a surprise. And I was stunned at times by where the book went. It was dazzling to me. I had not been reading things quite like that. Then there's the Books of Blood, Clive Barker. His work is another thing that I like to read, or at least listen to once a year, usually around Halloween during this time. And there's a lot of Books of Blood, but they are very formative for me. I can think of Stephen King books that I really love. I don't listen to their audiobooks. I tend to go right to Clive Barker because Barker was kind of a graduation for me from Stephen King. Not that I gave up on Stephen King, but it was the idea that it's kind of like the 101 course and then the 201 course. And Books of Blood was this exploration of things that weren't wholesome in any way, shape, or form. There's something about King that feels like he's looking at the things that are wholesome and showing you the dirty, nasty maggots underneath the rocks around that stuff. But in Clive Barker's world, we're already soiled, and we're already the wrong or the others that would normally be in other books, as maybe the villains or the transformation that comes to. Instead, we're starting out with many different versions of good and evil, and I love that it's as queer as it is. And it's amazing how revolutionary that was back in the 80s, and how, in a weird way, it hasn't really aged as much as many other people's books. There's another series that I like to take a look at, and that's the year's best hardcore horror. It's edited by Randy Chandler and Cheryl Mullenax. And I love the stories that are in there. As normally with any anthology, it's a mixed bag. But I love the originality. It reminds me a little bit of, again, Dangerous Visions, but for horror, which is, you can feel that many of these stories might be the stories that the author just can't get printed anywhere. Or people may have said, nah, that might be a bit much. So these are not what I would consider scary, as in you're going to jump out of your seat. This is more dread. This is more the idea of discomfort, but there are also amazing stories in there. And some of them are by very famous authors. Some of them are from up-and-comers. Some of them are first stories published. And I will say that if you like hardcore horror, in other words, this is going to be extreme horror, body horror, the ideas are going to be transgressive, it's going to be disturbing. If you like those, I would say that the year's best hardcore horror, I think, might be up to volume 6 now, volume 7, somewhere in there. There are some great stories. And I would say that volume 1 and volume 3 are probably my favorites. And it's the opening stories for both of them are really wonderful. They're not just gore for gore's sake. There's a real interesting spiritual side to these stories, which is kind of clever. And yet it's full of darkness and grotesquerie. And so anyway, there are several others that I like to read as well. Chainsaw Confidential, Gunnar Hansen's biography. Actually, it's more of his recollections of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from his side. Every time I read that, I realize that it's Rashomon done real and done over a horror movie. And it really is kind of surprising. He puts a lot of stuff of other people's words as he's interviewed other members of the cast, and he realizes that there's very few recollections that equal each other. In other words, they're somewhat very different in their memories. Shock Value is another book that I really like, Jason Zinoman's book, and I can't say enough about Jason's work. Shock Value is really a formative book for me. I think that it was when I started to feel that people were really starting to take horror seriously, that it wasn't coming from the fan perspective per se. In other words, it wasn't just Harry Knowles, if anybody remembers Harry Knowles. It was more like if suddenly Janet Maslin decided no, horror is okay. And to me, that means a lot. It's also not just opinion. It's interviews and research about some of the great horror cinema that has come up in the last 50 years. And then another book is True Indie, Don Coscarelli's book. And this is his career retrospective. And it's one of the best books out there of filmmaking, indie filmmaking in particular, let alone a book about some of my favorite horror movies, including Phantasm, which is really high up there in my pantheon. The thing that's really interesting talking about that, Shock Value, Jason Zinoman's book, and True Indie, Don Coscarelli's book, those last two talk about Masters of Horror dinners. And this is something that Mick Garris had started. I'm not necessarily sure I know what year or recollect what year they originally started. But it was essentially Mick Garris getting in touch with all the horror directors that he knows. He being someone who is not only a director but also a curator and an interviewer. He had interviewed people for decades in cinema. So he knows these guys. He knows their numbers. And he would get them together for these dinner parties, and they would just sit around and recollect and talk to each other. And what I get out of that, I think what blows my mind about these Masters of Horror dinners, and they're talked about from both Zinoman's point of view as a fly on the wall and Coscarelli's point of view as being someone who is considered a master of horror. And they walk in, and the reason these dinners were so important is these guys don't know each other. They know of each other. They've seen each other's work. They may have complimented each other. They may have sent each other letters or talked to each other on the phone or bumped into each other at film festivals or premieres. But they didn't really know each other. They didn't hang out. And it's such a strange thing for me to think of. You would think like Don Coscarelli is sitting there saying how he'd never met Tobe Hooper, and he's sitting there talking to him, and he was shocked meeting Larry Cohen, how much fun he was. So, and I think a lot of this, they're talking about these meetings, these dinners in these two books. I think what's really important and why I'm glad that they happen is that so many of these people are gone now. Stuart Gordon is gone. Wes Craven is gone. Larry Cohen's gone. Tobe Hooper is gone. Every year the list gets longer of those who are no longer with us. Even Mick Garris himself, he's had a podcast called Postmortem for 7 years, and it's been a Rondo winner, I think, every year for the last 7 years. I'm not sure, but he's retiring it this year. And so you get this feeling, once again, of the hello, goodbye. We're casting the runes. We're bringing back the spirits. This year I brought back the spirits of Larry Cohen and Stuart Gordon and Tobe Hooper. I have to get myself a little bit of Wes Craven in there somewhere. These folks are going away, and there is a new batch that are out there. And it's interesting watching the tail end of all of this. First, I would say that even though there are older generations of filmmakers, I think that there's something to be said about this generation of horror filmmakers in specific. They were coming back on the tail end of what was being considered the golden age, the second golden age of cinema, the Hollywood New Wave, the idea that in the 70s you had these maverick kids from film schools making movies. And so while in the spotlight you had your Coppolas and you had your Scorseses and your Friedkins, these folks were there on the forefront, the Altmans. They're being talked about and touted. At the same time, toiling just a little bit below that, in the upstairs, downstairs kind of world, were the horror guys. You had guys that were taking ideas that were there before and doing what was happening on the Golden Age side with people like Coppola. They were taking genre ideas, pulpy populist ideas, and adding something artistic to them, telling the story in just a different way, bending the way that people were seeing cinema at that time, imagining what had already been there in cinema language and moving that around, bringing the foreign film aesthetics to popular culture ideas. And so that really sings very well on that high level spot. You get your Bogdanoviches, who are coming up with really interesting ideas like Paper Moon, which feels like it could be a Capra film, but it still has this feeling of almost like the 400 Blows to it. And that's kind of the thing that you would see in the 70 films. At the same time, you have people who are looking at the horror movies before. They love them. They were science fiction fans. They read all of the magazines that were out there. They read all the pulp novels. They read the comic books, and they wanted to elevate those. And so Stuart Gordon's, the Larry Cohen's, the Tobe Hoopers, and the John Carpenters found ways to take these movies that weren't being taken seriously, this greasy kid stuff idea of horror, and really elevating that to something a little bit bigger, a little bit better. And it took time for the critical world and even the popular culture world to see their genius, but it's starting to be seen right in those twilight years. It is the first generation, I think, that is kind of important to take a look at. A lot of these guys are the age where they're the first teenagers. In other words, there were always people who were 16, 17, and 18, but they weren't always a demographic. They weren't always a marketing arena to pinpoint. Prior to the baby boom, there was no such thing. So you had these folks, and they were the first time that teenagers were being taken seriously, and you get that teenage rebellion and you get that teenage mindset coming in and saying, we do still, their own version of casting the runes. I adore House of Mystery. I'm going to bring the essence of House of Mystery into movie making. All of that happened. So I'm thinking about that as I'm watching this week, October 26th, 2023, John Carpenter was on Stephen Colbert's show, The Late Show. And I had seen John Carpenter on TV a couple times before, certainly early in his career when he was really starting to take off. They would have horror master John Carpenter on. For a long time, no, you didn't have John Carpenter, certainly not on network television. But I got to watch him on October 26th, and it reminded me, and I had to go back and take a look at the David Letterman performance where they brought John Carpenter on. That was June 9th, 1982. He was promoting The Thing at the time. So, the difference between the two is very interesting. It says a lot about where we've come with where horror is considered in respectability, the way that entertainment is looked at. So when we look at Colbert now, Stephen Colbert talks like a fan to John Carpenter. He knows all the details of The Thing. He's bringing up lines of dialogue. He's talking about the locations that are there. He's talking like someone who has listened to the Criterion Collection. He's listened to the audio commentaries. He's seen some of the documentaries that are special features. And he calls The Thing his go-to movie, which makes John Carpenter laugh. He goes, it's a movie about the end of everything. So I'm very happy that makes you happy. And then you take that and you parallel that with David Letterman. And this is Letterman 1982. He's really coming into himself, and he's in the snarky phase. This is when people are kind of afraid to go on Letterman. There was a time when going on Letterman, you had a chance to really look like a fool on national television. He would make fun of you. And there were several times that people got ready to walk off or just completely clammed up because he started making fun of them. So he's in this snarky phase at this point, and they have Carpenter come out and they start showing a clip of the thing. And this is the initial, this is where the dogs split open and everything. They don't quite show the dogs splitting open, but they do show the entire first reveal of the thing when all of the men at Outpost 31 are looking in at the dog cage and they see all this. And I'm stunned at how long the clip is. I wonder if they extended the amount of time that clip was supposed to be running, because it's essentially until the flamethrower, Childs brings out the flamethrower and burns it. Up until then, you're seeing everything. The squirming tentacles, all of that nasty stuff that's coming out, the squirming, the eyes opening up in the sides of some glob that's there. All of that is going on late night television, but it's still network television. And so I think it's there elongated to kind of make everybody in the audience squirm. And so when the clip ends, Letterman is kind of deadpanning, but he's obviously exaggerating and distorting his discomfort for comic effect. So he essentially goes, so it's about a boy and his dog. And, Carpenter tries to be nonplussed by that. You take a look at these two things, Colbert, and Colbert starts to talk about the bad reception that the thing got when it came out in 82, and now that it's considered a masterpiece. And Carpenter talked about how angry the studio was at him when that movie came out. He really felt the wrath. And Letterman, when he's on the Letterman show, this is the calm before the storm. That displeasure hasn't happened. That galvanizing failure does not happen yet. This is the calm before the storm. Carpenter's talking about how positive his experience was working with Universal. And I believe that Letterman brought up that in an interview before, he had said how he was very nervous about working with a major studio. And he said, did you find that this is a problem? He goes, no, they were very cool with me. They gave me creative control. And, what's interesting is that Colbert is really talking about Carpenter as a man as much as talking about Carpenter as a filmmaker. So he starts talking about music composing. He talks about helicopters. He talks about all the things that Carpenter likes doing more than directing films. And so at one point he asks whether Carpenter likes composing or directing movies more, and hands down, Carpenter's like, oh my God, give me composing any day. And he's like, really? And Carpenter says, yes, directing, you get 150 people. They're all in your back while you're directing. Everyone is telling you what to do. And then when the movie's done, you're all alone. You're the guy all alone in the hallway with the film cans. And all they want to do is kick your ass. When you fail, all they want to do is kick your ass. And Letterman, he is doing what you expect, I guess, in the 80s. You definitely get the feeling that this is like this interesting, and we're still having this conversation, but of all things to bring up, Carpenter goes, if you had an 8-year-old kid, do you have kids? And at that time, Carpenter did not. He goes, if you had an 8-year-old kid, would you let him see the thing? And Carpenter doesn't blink an eye. He just goes, yeah, I would evaluate my 8-year-old. And I'd ask if my 8-year-old was impressionable. Could they realize that this is a fantasy film? And if I thought so, sure, I'd let them. Now, if I was an 8-year-old kid, I'd want to see this movie immediately, no matter what the adults had to say about it, no matter what my parents had to say about it. And Letterman said, yes, I would imagine the kids would be lining up around the equator to see this one. Colbert, talks more of the idea of the impact that it has had. And he doesn't go down the path of, is this damning to children? I think that ship should by now have set sail, that is. And I will say that there will always be the folks who will hold the stronghold idea that somehow horror is hurting the impressionable youth. Colbert ends weird. And it's the reason for Carpenter's visit. They're not just honoring him for being John Carpenter. He has a new promotion, and he's I thought it would be for Halloween's 45th anniversary. I thought maybe he's on here to talk about that, but instead he was promoting a new limited series that he has on the Peacock channel called Suburban Screams. And that's the horror version of A Current Affair, as far as I'm concerned. It is the weirdest thing that I would have thought that Carpenter would get involved with. I don't know. He had one other weird thing in the 90s. It now isn't that weird, but at the time it seemed very weird. He did the score for a video game called The Sentinel Returns. And I got this video game just because Carpenter did it. And I couldn't understand the video game at all, but boy, I love the soundtrack. But now there was an even weirder thing, which is Suburban Screams, which is true stories, allegedly true stories being told, that have the talking head interviews with the real people, but it is all recreations, reenactments done with actors as if it's true cinema. And then in the middle of it, they just go back to these talking heads. And it really hit me weird. It's like A Current Affair. It's not quite a documentary. It's not quite a film. It's somewhere in between. And as our main character, John Nada, says in They Live, middle of the road, most dangerous place to stand. And I was not that excited by it. Colbert shows a picture of Carpenter directing his episode of Suburban Screams, and he's directing from his sofa in his house. Find out at that point that the show Suburban Screams, and when I was watching it, it seemed a little odd, but it still felt like it might be America. No, it's shot in Prague. It's filmed in Prague, and he directed from his sofa in the Hollywood Hills. And watching that, I kind of said, salute, John. I get that you've worked for it. You've earned the right to just put your feet up, play video games, smoke weed, watch the Lakers, and just let folks like me keep thinking about your movies. We'll cast those runes again and again and again. And, he's one of the last horror legends of that generation standing. I'll always be grateful for the films he gave me when I needed them. And they are part of my Halloween season. I watch The Thing and I watch The Fog every Halloween season, as well as a few other favorite movies. I return to a few horror stories or books that set up the mood, and these are some of the runes that I feel that I'm conjuring up. Another must-watch is Don Coscarelli's Phantasm. These things are, even though I've seen it a million times, there's something about Phantasm, hearing the opening of that film and hearing the score that's there, which is very minimal and still very wonderful. It's evocative of Tangerine Dream. It's evocative of John Carpenter's work as well. There's something about the very beginning of that film that just feels like the sunset again. That idea of me walking, and we're getting to twilight. We're no longer at sunset. We're a little bit past that. We're in dusk. So some of the things that, if I'm looking at casting some runes, there are things that I like to look at from the past that hit me hard. I have one of my high school teachers is still alive and kicking, Jerry Grink, Mr. Grink, and he was my biology teacher and environmental studies teacher. He was a great guy. He was, I don't know, maybe 15 years older than the students. I'm not sure. He was a young teacher. He was a weightlifting teacher. He was a hunter. He certainly had that temper and that cockiness that teenage years hadn't been that far removed from him. And I will say, into his old age, he still has that teenage spirit. And maybe it's that he spent most of his life surrounded by teenagers. But what I remember, and why Jerry is so important to me is he's part of the rebellion that I had with Halloween. I had mentioned before that my family was deeply religious. And they still are, and I was not allowed to celebrate any holidays. So you can just think of this guy here who's a horror maven, and I'm known for horror, and I've written books about it, and I go to conventions and people come to see me to hear me talk about horror. There was a time when on Halloween my family would sit in the dark, turning off all the lights so that trick-or-treaters would not come, and we would sit there as if we were like hiding from the Nazis. Be quiet, they're outside. It was that kind of thing. And the amount of like discomfort that my family felt over this, I think really kind of helped me fetishize it a little bit. It must really be some forbidden shit. And I could hear the kids like, we can hear you in there. And yeah, it became like egging on. Luckily, we never got egged. But there was this whole thing of turn out all the lights, do nothing. It felt like its own spell in its own way. Now, I really wanted to be involved in that. Halloween, and I'm sure I've said this before on this show, it was the one time of the year when everybody thought like me. Everybody for one day thought that ghosts were real and spirits were all around, and everybody's dressing up as these spirits. And of course I would make the sense memory of these are real ghosts. The kids are gone. These are real monsters. And so I hated when somebody did hobos or did sports figures. I'm like, no, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. It should be something terrible. I wanted to do that so bad. And some of the weird rebellion that I would do is I would kind of try to get myself involved with Halloween parades or whatever, just kind of walk the streets and then just kind of land in with the parade if it was going on. But I also did things like I would buy really cheap costumes, or I'd make cheap costumes. It was just like tearing up old clothes and putting fake blood on them. And I would put them in bags, and I would hide them in bushes around the neighborhood. And so I was allowed to go out and watch the trick-or-treaters when I got to a certain age. I didn't have to sit with everybody waiting for the rice mark to leave. Instead, I was able to actually go out and take a look at the costumes. And I took it, I would hide in bushes and stuff and just let them go by as if they were actually monsters. Now, of course, as a teenager, I wasn't going to get caught dead doing something like that. So I would hide these costumes, and then I would put them on if I had the courage to do so. And Jerry Grink gave me that courage. He invited me over for Halloween. He, myself, and a couple other students that he was friends with. And he would have his wife make food for us and everything. And this just is another sign of an era that it could not happen now. I can't even think of parents. My parents didn't allow it anyway. They didn't know any of this. But everybody just kind of just showed up at this teacher's house, who was, hip in his own way, and we were all nerds. He was nerdy. He was a biology teacher, for God's sake. And yet we showed up, and he didn't party with us or anything, but there was this great celebratory thing. We were able to do that without any major issues, I guess. And we ended up watching R-rated movies. We watched Halloween and Halloween 2. And so he invited me over, and I guess he had these other kids there before. And so it was a huge honor for me for anybody to want me to be anywhere. And so I was like, I'm going to do this. So I did. I hid a costume in a bush somewhere, and I put it on, and I don't know what it was, but I remember doing like makeup, like I had my eye removed. So I had fake blood on my face and everything like that. And he laughed when he saw me. He's kind of a gore hound. He loved the mad violence of Halloween 2. And so I remember spending that day with them and going, this feels like something that I'll have to remember for the rest of my life. It was a weird bit of defiance. And how defiant is it when nobody knows? Well, I guess they finally found out at some point, my parents, and they were upset. but they lived. They had worse things to deal with because I was now into heavy metal and all sorts of things and fast cars and beer. So I guess me going out for trick-or-treating and Halloween was not nearly as much of a death blow to them as it might have been back in those days. You know, it's still something of a revolutionary act in some ways to just be something as simple as a horror fan. It still raises some eyebrows at times, or you're kind of patted on top of the head and told that you're just being silly, you're being childish. It still has that kind of ring, and I don't know if that's necessarily an issue at this point. I can give less than 1/3 of a fuck about that kind of thing at this point in my life. But it is funny how speaking about horror gets people going in different ways. I love that there are people who get in touch with me now from my past, and they never watched horror movies, but now they're taking chances on horror movies. They ask me for recommendations. They get my book. People who went to school with me get my book, and then they're asking me for different recommendations. Or they tell me movies that were in the book that they watched, and like, I don't know what the hell you saw in that, but I did watch it, and I guess that's okay. I love that there is this recollection that is happening for them as well. I think they go back and remember that exactly what I say about this podcast, which is you have to remember that you used to love horror movies and you secretly still do. And that is for the folks who essentially say that, you know, they're not really that interested, or they've never been that interested in horror. I think that, you know, when it all comes down to it, when I'm looking at why I do all of this, you know, I'm writing another book, and one of the questions that I keep coming up against is, why are we so into horror, but also why are we so protective of it? Why does it matter so much? Of all the things, you know, you can almost understand everything else except for horror, at least if you're a non-horror person. You're like going, you could be into anything, and this is the thing that you go crazy for. It seems so counterproductive for it to make you happy. And I think part of that, the reason that it matters so much, is that you lose some currency. People asking that very question. And there's an act of defiance to it, because it's almost like you've been bullied, and you're going to stand up and spit the blood out from between your teeth and say, hit me again, try me again. There's that kind of defiance that there is sometimes in liking something like horror, when you hear for the last time how bad it is for people, and aren't you worried that it's going to twist you, or but there's so much pain in the world already, why are you looking at this? And it's like, my God, how often can you hear this before it drives you crazy? But I think it really comes down to the idea that we are so into it, we relive this stuff the way that we relive it, because it costs us a little bit of collateral. There's skin in the game. There is something to be lost when you're a kid, and for a while there, everybody's into horror. All of your friends, if they're men or boys, that is, at that time, they're probably into horror and something gross. And then at some point, they all kind of grow away from it, except for you. And there is this thing that happens where you lose a little bit of face when you're young, and you say something about horror, or you show a proclivity towards the grotesque and the obscene. You lose a little bit. And because of that, if you can either say, I'm done with it, or you straighten up your backbone, you get steely and you go right at it. And I think that's one of the reasons that it matters so much, is that we sit there and we go, screw it. There are questions that I ask people these days when I meet people at conventions, and it's 5 questions, and it starts at the first kiss. What was your first kiss? What was your first kiss with horror? Well, what was the movie that got you so jazzed? And the second question is, how old were you? And for the most part, it's anywhere between 8 to 10, 8 to 12. Sometimes people are late bloomers, but it's usually that early time. And so for that, I say, well, the third question is, who was your co-conspirator? Who was your corrupter? And it's usually an older brother or an uncle or one of the parents who decide, we're going to have this thing together. And then there's how did it make you feel? And sometimes it's that you didn't sleep for a week. Sometimes you hated the experience, but you had to come back to it. It somehow clicked in some way that you felt curious and you needed to find out a little bit more. Or sometimes you just fall flat out in love with it and you can't get enough and you start worrying everybody because you're so into it, carrying around little pictures of Frankenstein or the Frankenstein model or a doll. And people are like, what the hell's wrong with this guy? Stuff like that. And then the last question is, what was your jumping off point? And what is the jumping off point? What I mean by that, the jumping off point is the moment when you decide, what? I'm going to go public with this. I'm not going to hide this. I'm not going to pretend that it's not as big of a deal as it is. I'm not going to conform. It's just not that important to me to play the game for you. And so there's the moment, I like to call it the moment where you said, fuck it, I don't need to go to the prom. Let's go see Conan the Barbarian. That kind of thing is what I'm talking about when I say the jumping off point. I remember how scared I was of horror movies. And I've talked about how my dad would augment what I was going to. He would tell me what I could watch and what I couldn't watch. It was court-appointed horror. And the thing that I remember that I like to bring up is that I have soundtracks that I listen to all the time when I'm writing. They're horror soundtracks. I love the diversity of what soundtracks for horror are like. I listen to music that is scary. It can be scary songs, it can be murder ballads, whatever it might be. I tend to connect with music as much as I connect with horror films. And so it reminds me of something that I have. I don't think about that often, but I'm very grateful for my dad for a couple different reasons. And one of those is how he kind of got me to maybe a somewhat safe place in my life with horror, trying to get me out of being a scaredy cat and still, somehow feed the hunger that I had. So, by all accounts, I was a pretty well-behaved kid. Of course, I was a loudmouth, so I think they always say he used to be such a great kid when you end up being like me. But I was scared of my own shadow. There is a famous family story of how I got scared by the ABC TV Brady Bunch Halloween episode that came out in 1972. It's played for comedy, and yet there's a scene where Alice gets scared of a bust. It's a statue, a bust of, I believe, the father, and it's just in the shadows, and she sees it, and she thinks there's an intruder in the house, and I'm absolutely scared. I got scared by the Fat Albert Halloween special, and there's an interesting nugget right there. It scared me because they have a jump scare in there, and it's very funny, and you can see it a million miles away. But at that point in my life, I was scared of everything, and when I saw that freaked me out, something fierce. It's interesting that I went back to that. I think I bought it in the 90s, I want to say, late 80s, early 90s on VHS. And so now it's like multiple paper cuts instead of just one big paper cut. At the end of it, there's this narration that comes on from Bill Cosby, who says, unfortunately, this cartoon was made in a different era when people were allowed to go trick-or-treating and feel safe. And so it becomes this PSA of how you can't really do this thing anymore. Be careful, because there are people out there that are going to hurt you, which is such horseshit propaganda, because that was this fear-based thing that was going on in this, particularly in conservative world. The whole idea of the poison candy, the razor blades and candy was all urban legends. It's been disproved many times. There was one poisoning, and it was the father, I think, of the kid. So that becomes this whole hysteria thing that there's just strangers out there trying to poison your kids and that there's razor blades and apples. And it's amazing how that negativity flies so fast in the world. And of course, Bill Cosby being Bill Cosby, he was saying that shit back at that time. So it really left a bad taste. And then the extra paper cut is it's fucking Bill Cosby. But anyway, I digress as I usually do. So I was fascinated by things that could get under my skin so intensely. So I did love horror. So it was kind of this attraction, repulsion, unconditional loop that I was living. And my dad, to his credit, recognized that for what it was, that there was this attraction and fascination, curiosity, really wanted to get involved in something, but I needed to grow up a little bit and stop being so scared. And how was he going to do that? So he knew that I also loved music, and we had something in common in that. We connected and we bonded through music. And so my dad was a first-generation rock and roll fan. Once again, that first generation, right? That first set of teenagers. So he had this massive collection of records, and he didn't just get the hits, although he obviously got all of the 45s, the hits, 45 RPM records. And he also got every kind of novelty record that was out there. He would get strange songs that were sung by movie stars. But the novelty records were kind of an inroad because they were silly. And so he had novelty records like The Flying Saucer that was by Bill Buchanan and Dickie Goodman, which is probably the first mashup recording where they spliced song lyrics into a funny interview with a space alien. So Dickie Goodman, I think, is the interviewer, and he would say something, ask the alien a question, and it would answer with, "I'm all shook up," or something like that from Elvis. And, big fun for me as a kid. I really got into these novelty records with my dad, and it was even like comedy records with Andy Griffith and, live versions of Abbott and Costello. I just went down this whole line of stuff all day being an audiophile with my dad, and I started bringing in the idea of scary albums. And there was a time period where, of course, you're buying albums in the first place, but you didn't have to go to a record store to get albums. There were certain records that would show up at grocery stores, 5 and dime stores. And so there were novelty sound effects records. And there was a certain record that scared the bejesus out of me from the cover and the back cover, but I knew I needed it. And it was called Sounds to Make You Shiver. And on one side was musical numbers, I believe, and on the other side was sound effects. So you could put the sound of chains clanking and another of the wind and weird maniacal laughter. All those things are on this. And it was sold in like Woolworths, I think. And my dad bought it for me, even though he looked at the cover and realized, oh, it's all these monsters coming out of mansions. This may not go over very well. And on the other side was this flaming skull. It's something like, "You are about to die." It's like not a great thing to say to a scared kid. But because my dad and I had this connection with music, he decided that he was going to come up with a way to play act with me on this. And my dad was a frustrated DJ. He really used to spend hours playing songs and then recording with a monophonic tape recorder with just a little microphone on cassettes. He would make me music. So he would be a DJ, my own personal DJ, and give me all this stuff. So he decided there was going to be something else that we could do, and we were going to play act a little movie, do a little novelty record, if you so wish to say. So what we would do is we would pretend to be news reporters that we're going to go in and explore a haunted house. So me and my dad are sitting there with a microphone, and he's playing, he hits record, and he's getting the sound effects record, and he's playing the sound effects, and we're sitting right next to the speaker, so it feels like we are actually in the haunted house. And I would comment on the horrors inside, and my dad Neil dropped everything, sound effects of ghosts moaning and stuff like that. There was, we were right there with Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, man. We were just cutting back. But it's wonderful for me to remember that time, because there were great moments of sweetness with my dad. But, those are some of the things that I do to cast those runes. And a lot of it is being able to say hello and goodbye to what happened before, and also create some new stuff that's happening as well. It's not all about nostalgia. The thing that I love about being a horror fan, the thing that I love about Halloween, is that it does have this build up to this darkened shadow place. And then sooner or later, the dawn's going to come on November 1st. But before that, we're really going to party, and we're going to party hard. And the idea of wanting to be surprised still matters so much. The idea that you are so alive when you're surprised, whether that come out as comedy and you laugh, or whether it be horror and you're freaked out. There are a couple movies that I saw this year that I really felt surprised with, and I just want to talk a little bit about those. One that I think everybody has been talking about quite a bit is Talk to Me. And I will be another one to throw my hat in the ring talking about that. I won't say it's the best horror film of the year. It's been usurped. But for a while there, I thought it was the best of the year. And it's not because it is so blindingly original. It is that it tells its story so wonderfully economically and rather real, and it still has some great surprises. It feels very much like an M.R. James story, and I will say that I've been talking about Casting the Runes, which is an M.R. James story. It was made into Night of the Demon, a really, really great horror film. You can look that up yourself. But Talk to Me reminds me very much of an M.R. Jamesian story where you're not told essentially why things are happening. They just happen to be there. And you're getting the rules as things are going. And very much so, there's this, if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert on this, but there's a group of rules that are in this movie that I think is always interesting. It's, who are the rules for? Are the rules for the people, or are they the rules for the supernatural being? I'm always confused. Why would a supernatural being give a flying fuck about some of the things that these rules are supposed to be about? But those rules are like time bombs waiting to go off. They're these little shivers that happen. And Talk to Me is a really good one, which is that they have this ceramic hand, or this plaster of Paris hand, and it's outstretched and supposed to be from an oracle, or it's supposed to have all this power. It's all urban legend stories. It's secondhand stuff that kids are telling each other at parties. And if you grab onto this hand, there are two questions that you ask, or that you bring up, or two demands, I guess. They're not really questions, they're demands. The first is, talk to me. And that brings a flush of this spirit coming to you. You are the Ouija board. It's coming into you. And then it's the second command is, come into me. You can come in, essentially. And boy, I mean, anybody who knows anything about vampires, that's something that you just don't fucking say. So it really was well done, using something as simple as that, and this idea that you couldn't stay under with one of these entities in you for longer than, I forget what it was, 3 minutes or something like that. There's a time limit. I'm sorry, I don't remember. But with that, you have this time bomb waiting to go off. And there's this set of rules that are there to let you know that there might be a disruption to order. I mean, if you're dealing with the supernatural, what order could there possibly be? So having these rules let you know if something uncanny is actually going to happen. So even in the world of the supernatural, having rules means it can get even freakier than what it is already if the rules aren't adhered to. What I really loved about Talk to Me was that I felt that it genuinely connected and showed how cruel teenagers can be, but how laissez-faire they can be about death, the morbidity, and how essentially everything's about wanting to be popular, wanting to be part of the crowd, wanting to fit in, that you'll do just about anything to try and curry some favor so that you can be seen and loved. And I felt that loud and clear in this film. There's such a haphazardness to how they're dealing with their bodies. You can just think of this as like partying too hard, or doing the crazy stunt that you shouldn't do, or taking the drug that is really dangerous. Whatever it might be, you can feel that in this dare that there is of dancing the supernatural. The very idea that it's a party game to dance with a dead body, the spirit, not a dead body, but dancing with a dead spirit. And that really hit home as the movie continues on, and there are several surprises in it. I really did like Talk to Me a lot. Another movie that I thought was really good, and I'm gonna take a few chapters from the podcast that I had done with my friend Dr. AC for his Scare-a-thon this year. I was invited to speak on a couple of them. So a movie that I had seen before, but I ended up talking on a panel about. And I think it's really a very good film. And if you're looking for something else to watch, The Innocents, which is a Norwegian film written and directed by Eskil Vogt. And it is about a group of children living in basically a lower class apartment complex somewhere in Norway. And the kids, for no good reason that is never explained, some of them just start having powers. And it sounds like it's really simple. And maybe there is an elegance to the simplicity, but it's another really interesting fable about cruelty of children, cruelty of emotion, and power. The power of those that are oppressed and then get some power. Something that Stephen King was very good about talking about, which was that if you take a Carrie White and you give Carrie White powers, and she is going to be a worse bully than any of the bullies, the revenge will never stop. The vengeance will never satisfy. And I think that this movie has quite a bit of that. And yet, what really makes it very cool is that these kids aren't necessarily seen as villains, and they're not one-sided. It's not like a devious person. They're sorrowful at certain points. They are saddened by what they're doing. They're scared. They're angry. All of these wonderful emotions are put together in this film with this supernatural background to it. It is very well made, and it is kind of hard to watch at certain points. It's another film. All these movies that I'm going to talk about have a level of surprise to them, something about them that is unexpected. And I will say that it's well worth watching. It will probably trigger some people. I will, give one quick trigger warning, which is there's cruelty to animals at one point. And it was hard to watch. I will say that it is not the kind of thing that you've seen in cruelty to animal films before, where it's done. First off, I don't think it actually happens. They didn't actually kill an animal here, but it is done as a counterpoint. And it's an important counterpoint. It makes you very uncomfortable. It is a moment where you're at a crossroads, a couple different characters. You get to see the difference between someone who is restless and has mean thoughts sometimes, and someone who's actually truly sadistic. And I think that if we're all being honest, there are moments in all of our lives where we realize that we were cruel, and in ways that are shameful to think of, even though they're very human, especially around animals, or some, if not animals, something innocent or weaker than us. That moment when we played with that blood boil that comes with being a bully. So The Innocents from 2021, it's not rated. It earns its not rating. There are some things that are in there that it's not that they're extremely gory or anything. It's the subject matter can really get your pulse quickening. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I really liked it a lot. So that's one of the films that I wanted to talk about. And let's see, what's the next one we'll just bring up? I may have spoken about this one before, but I would love to see more people talk about it, and I would love to see it become a Halloween tradition. Now, The Witch in the Window is from 2018. It is a very low-budget film. It's by the director of Yellow Brick Road and We Go On, Andy Mitten, and it is a father-son story. It's basically a dysfunctional family story about a father who has not been around for his child. His child is, his boy is becoming a bit of an emotional problem for the mother. And he is kind of reluctantly forced to take the kid on for maybe a summer while he's going to a house and trying to flip the house. In other words, he's going to fix it up, and then he's going to sell it off. And he gets this house that has a little bit of a history to it. And I mean, the name of the movie is The Witch in the Window. This is one of those films that I don't want to talk too much about, but I do want to say that I felt that the connection between the father and the son really helped sell this movie. And I think what I liked about it a lot is it's not your traditional thing where it's not Atticus Finch. Yeah, the father is not Atticus Finch. This is not a guy who has all the answers and knows how to be really cool and calm and collected and have a great moral understanding of what's going on. No, that's not this guy. This guy is kind of a screw up. And he talks to his son like a peer. And I remember those moments with my dad when there were certainly times where my dad was kind of a low rent Atticus Finch. And then there were the times when he was kind of just like one of the guys where he had conjured up the youthful side of himself, the kid, and he was playing with me as if he was a kid. And there are moments in this movie where you could almost see them like the Hardy Boys. They're discovering this mystery inside of his house, and then where it goes from there, it has to do with the connectiveness that the two have, their connection, that there's really a deep love in there. I don't want to say any more about it. It's a movie that I hope people will watch because it's super low budget. It's super delicate, right? And it's only got certain things it's going to be able to do. And I want that magic to be there for anybody who decides to watch it. There are some surprises in it. They're all low-res surprises, but they're really good. I love that the movie goes where it goes in kind of breaking away from expected tradition of that kind of story. I really appreciate that one. It reminds me of Lady in White, which is another film that I think really should get some attention, and another one that is new to me this year called Cobweb. Now, Cobweb is a really strange and interesting film. I won't say that it's a perfect film, but I will say it is really good. And it's really good, especially because nobody seems to know about it. It kind of fell through the cracks, and I'm surprised that it fell through the cracks because it stars Anthony Starr from The Boys. So he's a huge name at this point for anybody who's in genre work. And Lizzie Kaplan, who was in, oh my goodness, Cloverfield and a few other things. These are, actors with some heft behind them. It's a very strange story about an 8-year-old boy who is in his house, and it's right around Halloween, and there's weird knocking sounds behind his wall, and his parents are acting strange, and it seems like they know something's behind the wall. And there's this weird secret inside of the house, and it's something that the parents are keeping hidden from the kid, and the kid is going to school and he's drawing strange drawings which seem as if it's abuse. But is it abuse? Is it from the parents? We don't necessarily know, and the parents are acting very arch. I will say that this is not a movie where people are acting normally. This is a movie where everything is somewhat arch in the way that it's being done. It is trying to go for a little bit more of an expressionistic idea. But what really makes this movie sing is, like The Lady in White, you can almost smell autumn in this film. And there's a monster in here that is a pretty unique looking monster, and I love where it goes, and it has some good surprises in it. So Cobweb, 2023. So when talking about like or don't like, sometimes that's a little bit too easy or pat to even get to. And I think that comes with the next film that I want to talk about, because I was asked to talk about it, and I had seen it before. I had to watch it one more time. And that movie is The Outwaters from 2022, I believe. And it's directed and written by and starring Robbie Banfitch and a few other people. I think it's a 3-person, for the most part, movie, somewhat reminiscent in that fashion of the beginning of the found footage explosion being the Blair Witch Project. This isn't the Blair Witch Project. This is more in the world of liminal horror, which has become quite popular with Skinamarink, or become infamous and talked about. There are people who absolutely love this kind of film, and there are those that do not. And they are very loud about it on either side. But this is essentially, I think there's really 4 people. 2 women, 2 men who are going into the desert to shoot a music video, as I remember. They're doing a remote thing out there in the Mojave Desert. And strange things start to happen. And of course, what we're seeing is this cobbling together from the police department of the video footage that was done. So yes, what you expect out of a found footage format, that framework is there. And then it just decides to go wherever it damn well wants to. The thing that I find really interesting about The Outwaters is that when I talked to Dr. AC about this, we both were like, you can't get around the idea that this running time is an hour and 50 minutes. This feels like a story that could be told maybe in an 80-minute frame, not an hour and 50. It doesn't seem like it would need to go that long. But the idea of the length, I think, is the story that's being told. There is another story, perhaps, that you could do at 80 minutes. This movie needs to take you on that hour and 50 minutes excursion of, you can't escape this. It's the thing about Skinamarink that I thought was very amazing. And neither of these films can I sit there and say, oh, well, this is something that I'm going to watch every year at Halloween. That's not going to happen unless something amazing happens. But what I am absolutely sure of is that this is something that is new. This is that moment, this weird jumping off point of my own and my own generations, where we're not quite the ones being catered to. There's a new way of looking at the language of cinema. And I can't help but remember that when Bonnie and Clyde, Arthur Penn's movie, came out in the 60s, that people were outraged by that movie. The older generation was outraged and they were confused. I thought you were the summer love kids. What are you doing watching all this violence? And so the violence of that movie, the strange editing style of it, the weird tone of it, and this thing of championing people who were gangsters and criminals and bank robbers, completely confounded the older generation. And it was a cinematic style that was a sea change. And I can't help but think about those types of movies from the 60s and the 70s where it just galvanized people in just being a different way of taking the narrative. And I can't help but feel the Outwaters and Skinamarink. And if you had to watch one, I would say the Outwaters is kind of the action film out of the two, which you may laugh out loud if you've seen the Outwaters. But I will say that between the two, Skinamarink is not necessarily fast-paced. And they're both, I think, an hour and 50 minutes. So there's something about the length, needing to go past the comfort zone of length. But I think the thing that really is revolutionary about this, and I want to see where this goes. It seems like the new generation of horror fans are finding something else horrifying. The bleakness, the never changing of existence. And I don't want to just generalize it as that. I think what I see is that what used to look like it was a short attention span is people finally being done with the hero's journey. I don't know what that means for us, but I see that this film style is breaking away from a very standard way of telling stories. The 3-act narrative, it's stifling. I think we've gone to that well so many times it's become boring. And I think that there's also the idea that people are now very, very understanding of the world of video games, shall we say. This is not unusual. The idea of how stories are told has been brought down in horror video games. So the idea of waking up in a room and having no idea what's going on until you find another clue is a valid way to do a narrative. And so I think that we're looking at a new kind of breakaway. Now, is that going to be huge? I doubt it's going to be huge. I consider it like the Dogma 95 of horror. But it is something unique. It is something original. And it is calling attention to the idea of a stale narrative. When people say that they don't like jump scares, they don't like traditional jump scares. They don't like lazy jump scares. They don't want obvious jump scares. They want something that's surprising. Everybody wants surprise. And so there is this kind of a call to arms against how narrative has gotten lazy. And so I don't think that total dismissal of all the rules is going to become huge, but just like Dogma 95, it starts a conversation about where narrative had been going. I'm excited to see where it goes because I did find the Outwaters so experimental in many ways and frustrating in many ways. And now going from something that was experimental, that's new, just to show that experimentalism isn't something absolutely new, and there's always been something radical going on. I wanted to go back to 1973. If this is a movie that I rewatched, it's a British film. It was actually a TV movie from the BBC back in 1973, but it came to my attention through the great documentary, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror, that was done by Kirla Janis. And Kirla did an amazing job. There's 3 hours and 20 minutes, I think, of just insanely in-depth deep diving about what horror movies are really all about and the power of myth and just this concept of how folk horror, nature horror, whatever you want to call it, is seen from many different views, many different cultures, and some of the history that goes around that. But the movie that I'm talking about is called Penda's Fen, PENDA''S''FEN. And it is a really intriguing, beguiling, and slow burn movie, experimental horror film that at times feels more like a fairy tale than a horror film. And I'm not sure what the big difference is between those. I guess the only thing that I would say is that this movie unnerves you more than it does scares you. And even that is not a great definition of a horror film at all. It's a very interesting story about a young boy growing up in England, and he is someone who wants to conform very badly, and he doesn't understand why there's something wrong with him that he can't seem to conform. What I think is interesting is that this movie talks very shockingly and openly about sexuality, particularly homosexuality, with a teenager. There are several things that are said that inside of that I would today cause consternation and probably comments from Congress if it was to come out in the United States. It's extremely interesting to see how we were looking at conformity and homosexuality and industrialism and commercialism at that time in 1973, and how much more radical and progressive it was than some of the things that are happening right now. I found the movie a breath of fresh air and kind of startling at certain points, and I think that it's very literary. And it is somewhat like a play at times. Penda's Fen really talks about the idea of what used to be. Once again, the idea of the past informing the future, trying to grab on to something from the past to inform what's happening to you now, is one of the central themes that are inside of Penda's Fen. And it's hard to find if you don't have the box set that Woodlands Dark came in. You can find it on YouTube. And since it is so hard to find, I have no shame in or concerns about guiding you to look for Penda's Fen on YouTube. The entire movie is there for your taking. The last movie I want to talk about is also the one that I consider the best movie of 2023, the best horror film of 2023. And I'm hoping will get a much larger audience. In its initial run in the theaters, I think it was underwhelmed. But it has been picked up by Shudder almost immediately. I think Shudder was actually involved in its creation. It's an Argentinian film, and it's by Damien Rugna, who I spoke so highly of when his movie Terrified came out. Well, this is his follow-up to Terrified, When Evil Lurks. And it is astonishing in many ways. It's a very exciting film. It's a very enraging film at certain points. And I think that this is the movie, this is the Exorcist film that we need now, not Exorcist, whatever it's called, Believer. Sorry, I didn't mean to be so fey about that, but my thing about The Exorcist, and I love the film The Exorcist, but I'm ready to put it away at this point because I don't know how relevant it is anymore. I have been saying this for a while, which is in a more secular world than there ever has been, does The Exorcist hold any punch? It's very much a religious tract at this point, whereas it didn't necessarily feel that way when it first came out in a different era. There was something really kind of antagonistic about talking about what The Exorcist was talking about at that time period. And even discussing weakness in the church was somewhat transgressive and controversial. So there was a shock value that was built right into it. But 50 years on, The Exorcist film, every possession film seems to be so beholden to The Exorcist. And I'm not necessarily sure that the way to go is through some religious fashion. What I think is great about When Evil Lurks is that it is a observation on evil and the nature of evil without there being any religion involved. And in fact, this seems to be a movie about what happens to us when God calls it a day, and the churches call it a day, and evil is still coming. So it's really interesting. In some ways, you can read it as this is what happens when you get rid of churches. And in another way, you can read it as, well, this isn't really about possession per se, but it is about a form of possession. What happens when we forget what has come before us? What happens when there is no context in what we learn in news and what we learn in science? What is it when we just take things as they're happening without anything that's come behind it? This is a movie that looks at evil as perhaps a disease of thought, and the idea that evil itself, whether it be a demon, whatever it may be, is so much more powerful than you and wiser and older than you, that there is a sense of dread that nothing can possibly be done. There are some really shocking moments. There are some amazing scares that are in this film, but what I love about it is that it doesn't try to explain much. It just lets this madness happen, and it's done so stylistically and so cleverly. And another reason why I think of it as the new Exorcist is that not only is it a look at possession from a different mindset, but it also, kind of like William Peter Blatty was able to do, it talks almost professionally about sadism and evil. In other words, it feels like there's some really evil stuff actually happening. And that's what made The Exorcist and Exorcist 3, which Blatty wrote and directed, so effective. The idea of diabolical evil being so much advanced and ahead of you, and just loving to watch you squirm, making you feel fucked with before actually fucking you over, is something that is rare to actually see done well in movies. And Blatty did an excellent job of writing that kind of venality. And I think When Evil Lurks has it. There is a palpable sense of this movie's going a little too far. It's going in the spot it shouldn't go. And there are not easy characters for you to like in it. It's really intriguing. And I found it the best film of the year. And I hope that you enjoy When Evil Lurks if you decide to watch it. And with that said, Halloween is upon us. I'm certainly hoping that you were able to feel a connection with me from some of the things that I was speaking of, that I think of and that I watch and that I feel when I get in the spirit of Halloween. This ritual that I do every year, from putting plastic objects up on my house and having everybody go ooh ah, to sharing my conversations and an almost intimate level of love for film with other people, sitting and watching movies and that I've seen a million times, just to be able to walk in the shoes of the person who saw them for the first time, just for that little bit of time. All of that stuff is kind of what mixes together for me for Halloween, what makes it so special to me. It is how I cast my runes, my story, where it's going, how it ends up where it is. All comes from the experiences that happened to me before. This dancing with spirits, and the spirit that I'm dancing with is a younger version of me, a version that saw the world in much more clear eyes in some ways. Someone who realized that dusk is full of possibilities of the unexpected. And I loved walking in that. And I still love walking in it. I hope you enjoy it too, and I hope you'll walk with me at least one more time, at least for this night. Happy Halloween. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.